In today's tutorial, you are going to learn how to create a reverse bassline sound like the one you have just heard a while ago. What is interesting about this video is that we will not be using any synthesizer to create the reverse bassline itself. Also, this tutorial is mainly for FL Studio users. If FL Studio is the DAW you are using on an everyday basis, consider subscribing to my channel, because from now on I will be making as many FL Studio tutorials as for Ableton. The project from today's video, you can download it from my Patreon website, and if you would be interested in screech leads or sawtooth leads or any other synthesizer sounds that would go along well with this kick drum and bass line, check out my Techno Reinforcement Volume 2 preset pack website. This pack will be filled with around 40 presets for both Serum and Ableton Wavetable. On top I will add some Ableton effect tracks and MIDI melodies to use. Sign up for the waiting list, download a demo version of the product and get notified as soon as the full version of the pack is released. For this style of beat we will need a clean kick drum sound. I can already say that Vengeance kick drums are going to be too dirty for this kind of beat, because usually in Vengeance kick drums we have lots of noise or other textures that make this kick drum not clean enough. Where to find clean kick drum samples? I recommend using Splice. And it would be good to explore kick drums not only for techno music. In case of this tutorial, I can be interested in finding either a psytrance kick drum and as you have heard, the kick drums for psytrance are very clean. They have also a very clicky high end, but maybe these kick drums lack a bit of low frequency punch that we will need to make our techno beat pumping more. So aside from using psytrance kick drums, I can recommend trying out either drum and bass or dubstep kick drums. Of course, you can also try to look for techno kick drums on Splice, but most of these samples are going to have a rumble sound underneath, which we will not need anyway. Anyways, after a few minutes, I got 5 or 6 different kick drums that we can drag and drop into FL Studio. I have already organized and grouped the kick drum samples. Now we want to fill out what kick sound is going to fit to our beat most. So let's try playing a 4-4 pattern on each of these kick sounds. To do that quickly, I can right click the channel name and hit the 4 key on keyboard. That will automatically create a pattern in the sequencer that I want to have. Let's do that to all of these samples. The first kick drum and the third one sound too dirty, they have some noise inside of the samples. The second kick drum has a weird hi-hat sound layered with the kick, and that's something I wouldn't like to have. And this kick drum is simply too short and doesn't have enough punch. So in the end, I'm going to use the kick drum number 4. Now I can open the channel settings and modify the sample further. What comes first to my mind is changing the pitch of the kick drum. In case of this kick drum, I actually prefer the sound without changing the pitch, but the remaining adjustments could include starting to play the sample from a different point using the start offset knob. We can use this if we want the kick drum to hit a bit softer. This will cut a bit out of the transient. Sometimes if a kick drum is going to be too clicky, we can use that. Also, we can make this kick drum a bit shorter, or we can add some fade in and fade out. And for that, I recommend using the volume envelope, which you can find under the second tab. We just have to turn on the envelope that, well, is going to control the volume of the kick sample according to the curve that we create here. For example, right now the kick drum hits very soft, so to get rid of that fade in, I have to turn down the attack. To shorten the sample, what will be most important for us is that part of the envelope, which we can control by using decay and hold controls. I can imagine that with the hold knob, I am adjusting the length of the sample, and if there's a need to create a little fade out, I can use the decay knob. This is the way to trim the sample. And now, out of the same kick drum I've just shortened, I'm going to create a bassline. We have to duplicate the whole channel, so I want to select that and hit Alt and C keys to clone the sample. To have more control over the rhythm of this bassline, instead of using a sequencer, I will use the piano roll. Let's play the sample at the root note. Typically it's equal to C5. And we are ready to transform the sample. We return to the sample settings, and by using both crossfade, length and pitch controls, we will be creating the bassline out of this kick drum. The most important knob will be the crossfade one. As you can see, when I turn it on, I'm starting to loop a certain part of the kick sample. And further, the sound can be fine-tuned using the lengths and pitch controls. Let's listen to the bassline in solo. Even though we looped a small part of the kick drum, whenever we play a note we can still hear the click coming from the original kick sound. To cut it, we will be using the sample start. Personally, I would keep using the length knob to adjust the timbre of the bassline, and later when there's a need to adjust the pitch of the whole sound, I would use the pitch knob in the end. In that way, we are making this sample work just like an oscillator in a synthesizer. If we think of a wavetable synthesizer like Serum or even Ableton Wavetable, synthesizers like that utilize wavetables. That is a set of very short audio samples that are looped infinitely. By using the crossfade knob in FL Studio on this kick drum sample, we are doing the exact same thing. A very small part of the kick drum sample is looped and repeated. After you fine-tune the pitch, the timbre of the bassline sound, we can play more with the rhythm itself. The first thing we could do is to make the bassline appear a bit earlier or later. We still want to play the bassline offbeat, but we could as well make it start playing here, from here, or there. Adjusting the rhythm inside of the piano roll can look like that, so the most common way to sequence the bassline would be to start playing it right in the middle of each beat. What is definitely more concerning is the lack of sidechain compression. Usually to make the bassline pump, we want to make it dark and create some sort of a fade in. We will not be using any sidechain plugin as we could usually do, and that would include the Kickstarter plugin by Nicky Romero or LFO tool by Xfer. We can create a sidechain effect again using the sample editor and the envelope. But this time we will want to utilize the attack knob as well, that will create a fade in for the sample. If we want to delay the whole bassline sound, that is to make it appear a bit later, not only we can shift the notes to the right manually in the piano roll, I can also play around with the delay knob in the same envelope. After adjusting the channel more precisely, my bassline sounds like this and has a following rhythm. Now we can start to process these two sounds individually in the mixer. At first we will begin with adjusting the volume of the bassline in relation to the kick drum sample. In FL Studio, these channels have to be assigned to the mixer first. I can select them both and hit Ctrl and L buttons that will automatically assign these selected channels to 3 mixer slots. But setting up the mixer like that is not enough. Later, when I adjust and process these two samples individually, I will be interested in adding some group processing. So I will want to work with 2 samples at the same time later. So I have to create such a group. At first, let's shift these tracks a bit to the right. I'm using for that the Alt and right arrow key combination. And this channel will be something I'm gonna use for group processing. Now look at the bottom of the mixer. Typically, each channel in the mixer is routed already to the master channel. I want these sounds at first to be routed to the kick and bass group, where I'm going to create a group processing chain. So let's unplug these individual channels from the master channel. And by clicking these arrows here, I'm going to route these 2 individual channels into the kick and bass group. And then the kick and bass group is routed towards the master output. And at first, as I've just said, I will adjust the volume of the bassline in relation to the kick drum. We can do it even with a fruity balance effect. Currently, I think this bassline is a bit too loud in relation to the kick drum, so let's turn its volume down. The kick drum sample we found on Splice is very clean, maybe even a bit too clean. Even though the sample already sounds decent, as usual, it needs a bit more processing to make it fit to our beat. The first thing I want to do is to make the sample just a bit more dirty. It means that I will want to use some saturation effect. We can go with anything we want to. It could be the Sound Toys Decapitator. Personally, I'm going to use the iZotope Trash 2. What is important is that the amount of distortion added has to be very little. According to Trash 2 manual, if we want the kick drum or any other sound to be distorted as fast as it can, we want to make the input level of it touch the yellow area of the volume meter. Just like that. I can already add an equal amount of output gain to balance out the volume levels and start distorting the kick drum inside of the trash section. Using the distort wave shaper curves category will be enough. I can already tell that such complex curve like this one or that one are not going to be useful because we want to saturate this kick drum slightly. So try something with a more gentle curve like Amp Trainer or Blues Driver. Typically, to fine-tune the distortion, we can use these faders, as well as the drive knob itself that does the amount of distortion, but we can also increase the pre-gain using the pre-fader. Most of these faders and controls here fine-tune the wave shaper distortion curve, and they dictate the character of distortion. Right now, if I bypass the whole effect, we can hear that the kick drum after distortion is way louder than it should be. It makes comparing the sound of the kick drum a bit more difficult. To make a more fair comparison, I want to turn down the output to more or less match the loudness of the kick drum after distortion to the loudness of the kick drum before it. And now it's easier to hear that the kick drum like that is saturated a bit too much. We will want to turn down the amount of distortion a bit, but before that, let me advertise myself quickly and just say that if you wish to have other sound design or music production subjects explained in such an easy and practical way, step by step, consider going onto my website to learn more about my private music production lessons. Free consultations are available as well. The easiest way to turn down the amount of saturation added to the kick drum would be by using the mix control that works just like a dry wet control for any other effect. That gives most influence on how aggressive the distortion is going to be in the end. But also we can use a bit of drive knob to tame the distortion more by turning it down. Whether you will be using the drive or the mix knob to make the distortion less noticeable is up to you, but keep in mind that each of these adjustments might require you to adjust the output gain once more, because once we change the amount of distortion added, the output volume of the kick drum will change as well. The next step to process the sample would be to equalize the bassline a bit. Maybe your first thought would be to use some saturation on the bassline too. We have seen how does it work like on the kick drum sample, and we have heard that using distortion helps making the kick drum sound more fat. But I don't think that our bassline needs to be any fatter. After all, we have been resampling the kick drum, and the bass sound we got straight out of it has already gritty and has quite a lot of high end. So for me, what is more concerning is that amount of high end in the bassline that I would like to cut away first. I can also hear that the bassline is a bit muddy, which is something I'm going to show you in a minute when using an equalizer. It all means that before I decide to saturate the bassline a bit more to make the bassline fatter, at first I want to make it sound cleaner, because this is something I find more important. That's why on the bassline, instead of using distortion at first, we will be using an equalizer. And the Fruity Parametric EQ2 is going to be a great plugin just for that. Inside of that equalizer, I will take care at first of the high end. We can begin by removing the high frequencies, preferably by using a high low-pass filter. We are interested in only removing that highest noise in the bassline sound. Removing the highest frequencies from the bassline will not only help it make it sound more clean, but if we were to add to this beat later some percussion and hi-hats, these hi-hats would have more space in the mix. The second thing I was worried about is the muddy sound coming from the bassline. When we think of a muddy sound, we can typically associate it with an excess of frequencies from around 200 Hz. And as we could see on the frequency spectrum, we have quite a few distinct frequencies to check out from that frequency range. Sometimes, if you want the low frequencies to be visible more precisely on the spectrum, we can go into the settings of the parametric EQ2 and adjust the frequency precision control. Now what I will do is I will boost on purpose that muddy sound I will want to remove later, so we know what I'm talking about. Frequencies like that help making space sounds warm. Without these frequencies, it would be impossible for your track to sound, well, warm and full when it comes to the low end, but in case of this sound, we are having a bit too much of these frequencies. That's why I want to make a precise cut, and it means I want to set the filter bandwidth to narrow. Of course, low end does not consist only from the frequencies from around 200 Hz. Now, maybe to compensate a bit for that cut we made in around 150 Hz range, we can make the bassline sound more deep and heavier by using a low shelf filter. The low shelf filter is going to enhance almost anything below the 200 Hz frequency range we have just cut. Let's change the type of that filter into low shelf. And make the equalizer boost the bassline just like that. Let's quickly compare the before and after effect. And you can hear how clean the bassline is. In the end, I equalized the bassline just like that. I added one more filter to take care of another hissy sound inside of the bass. At first, we will preview the changes this filter creates. Using an equalizer means that we are adjusting the volume levels of individual frequency ranges or just frequencies. Whether we are cutting some high frequencies or boosting the low ones, it can have its influence on the overall volume of the bassline sound. That's why it's not unusual to adjust the volume of the bassline once again after equalization, and for that another Fruity balance can be used. The processing of the bassline is finished. As you could see, thanks to creating a bassline out of the kick drum by resampling it, there wasn't much of work needed to make a bassline sound full. If we tried to create a bassline using a synthesizer like Serum or Vital, of course we would be getting a different bassline sound. That could be something you would be interested in as well. But there's also a high chance we would need to use quite a lot of saturation to make the bassline fat enough. In case of this bassline here, mostly an equalizer was needed. Now we will return to the kick drum sample, because this kick drum sample will also need a bit of the equalization. And in fact, equalizing the kick drum will look similar to equalizing the bassline itself, with a single exception. What will be one of the most important things when equalizing a kick drum itself is that I will want to boost the frequency range of around 100 Hz. In that frequency range, most of the kick drum's punch will be present. So if you think the kick drum is not punchy enough in the low end, instead of boosting the frequency range here that will make the kick drum sound just deeper, won't focus on a bit higher frequency range. As with the bassline, this kick drum can be also a bit cleaner. So if we want to make the kick drum sound a bit cleaner, again we could take a look at the frequency range from around 200 to 400 Hz. Making a cut here will make the kick sound cleaner too. When equalizing the bassline, we also used a low-pass filter as well as another filter to make a cut at 2K range. Similarly as with the bassline sound, I'm also going to make a cut at 2K range to remove a bit of that hissy sound coming from the kick sound. And a low-pass filter will make the kick a bit cleaner by removing the air from the sound. In the end, this is how I equalize the kick drum. Individually, the kick drum and bassline already sound very decent, so now the most important for me would be to apply some group processing, mainly to glue both sounds together. When it comes to gluing, we can use two different approaches. If we want the kick and bass sound to sound a bit less clean and we care about dirty and distorted bass sound, of course, to glue kick with bass we can start with using distortion. But if I want to keep the clean sound, and this is something I am interested in doing now, my first choice would be to use a multiband compressor. The multiband compression is typically an advanced mixing technique that would take quite a lot of time to explain. I already have a detailed tutorial on how to use multiband compressor inside of Ableton, so even if you are using FL Studio, I would recommend you to watch this video to get more understanding of the multiband compression in general. But if there will be a need, I will make a separate video about using a multiband compressor in FL Studio. Because I don't want to make this tutorial very long, we will only compare the sound of the kick and bass sound together before and after using the multiband compressor. As you could see, it's added on the kick and bass group that I created quite a long time ago. And inside of the multiband compressor settings, because the bypass switches are turned on the low and high frequencies bands, it means that I am compressing only the mid frequencies range. And typically, to glue the kick and bassline sounds, compressing the mid range is the most important. Typical settings of multiband compression like that will be following. To preserve the punch from the kick drum sound, I'm using quite long attack. If I zoom out, you will see that it's set to 90 milliseconds. But to not make the bassline fall behind, to stop the compression fairly quickly, we are using also quite short release that's equal to 100 milliseconds. Then it's a matter of using both threshold and ratio to tell the amount of gluing added to the sound. Now let's listen to the kick drum and bassline with and without the multiband compressor to see how much gluing is added. Using a multiband compression on the mid frequencies like that make these mid frequencies a bit flatter and glued. After using the multiband compressor, once the mid frequencies are glued well, it's time to equalize both kick drum and bass line. When it comes to equalizing the kick drum and the bass line together, one of more fundamental things could include using a high-pass filter with its cutoff frequency set to around 30 or 40 Hz. In that way, we can get rid of the lowest frequencies that would be almost inaudible and unhearable for us, and this is often making the low-end sound a bit cleaner. Another thing to notice and to remember is that using high-pass or low-pass filters just like that are also going to add considerable amount of phase shift in some of the frequency ranges. What it means is that some of the low frequencies are going to be shifted in time a bit in relation to other frequencies that this high-pass filter is not going to touch. Depending on the high-pass filter settings, this could make the bass line and the kick drum sound better or worse. So while using a high-pass filter like that is not something mandatory, it's not something that's going to always work, this is something we could definitely try. In case of this kick and bass sound, I think it makes the sound a bit cleaner. When it comes to making the sound cleaner, once again, I could make a small cut at 200 Hz range. And more precise equalization regarding the mid and high frequencies will follow. So let's start with cleaning the kick sound a bit more, the kick and bass sound more, by making a cut somewhere at 2 or 3K. Generally, if I want to find what frequency range would be worth cutting, I want to use a peak filter like that, set a lot of attenuation and sweep through the frequency spectrum to find the frequency range that should be removed. So now I discovered that the bassline again is a bit too hissy. We have quite a lot of high end still. And this is the frequency range I will be cutting now from both kick drum and bassline. So the bassline again becomes more clean. Of course, we are cutting the same frequency range from the kick drum itself, but as we can hear, it doesn't hurt the sound. In the end, this is how I equalized both kick and bass sounds. The high-pass filter still is useful for making the low-end sound more cleaner, but I have lots of precise equalization moves. The last thing is to glue just a bit more the kick drum and bass line using some saturation. In the group processing, when it comes to gluing sounds together, I can't say any bad thing about, well, trying out the decapitator. BSD. At first, I want to choose either one of these 5 distortion styles available, so to make a more informed choice, at first let's use quite a lot of drive to pick the distortion style that we think is going to sound best. Once you pick the distortion style you like, we want to turn down the drive knob to a more appropriate value. Once again, similarly as with the individual kick sound, we don't want to use a lot of saturation here. Just a slight amount will be enough. After all, we glued the bassline with the kick drum with the multiband compressor. Turning down the drive knob to add less of distortion is one way to make the saturation work more subtly. But similarly as with the trash tool, we could make use of another approach, that is maybe using a bit higher amount of drive and using the mix knob instead to blend the effect. Personally, I find using the mix control along with a bit higher drive to be a bit more effective. That's because when I can blend the effect enough with the mix knob, with the drive knob I can find the type of saturation and the distortion, the sound of distortion that I like most. In the end, this is how much of saturation I added to kick and bass together. The last step to finish the kick and bass sound would be to make the kick drum sound a bit more clicky and snappy. I want the transient of the kick drum to be louder, but the rest of the sound should be a bit quieter. It's a perfect task and opportunity to use a compressor. So the compressor will be used only on the kick sample because there is no need to compress the bassline anymore, and the compressor will be the last effect I will use in the kick drum processing chain. Even the Fruity Compressor is going to be enough and it's going to work well. At first I will add a lot of compression. If I were to explain current settings of a compressor, we would hear that the kick drum again loses all the punch. That is because of a very short attack. It's now set to 15 milliseconds, but once we keep increasing it, we will hear more and more punch coming from the kick drum sound, or more and more click we want to preserve. And this difference will be quite easy to hear because of the amount of compression I added before with both threshold and ratio. That's why I began with adjusting these two knobs at first. Another time-related control is the release. It's going to tell how fast the compressor will stop turning down the volume of the kick drum once the volume of the kick drum is higher than minus 27 decibels, which is our threshold level. This is something I'm going to adjust according to my liking. Shorter release usually give a more aggressive compression sound. Shorter release settings usually preserve the tail of the kick drum because we stop compressing the sound earlier, but in case of the single sample, the release control is not going to be that important. In the end, we want to adjust the ratio knob to tell the amount of compression added. We have to use the ratio in pair with the gain, because changing the amount of ratio will change the amount of decibels by which the volume of the kick drum is turned down. So this is going to make the kick drum on average quieter. To compensate for that amount of compression, we will be using the gain knob to bring the loudness of the kick drum back to normal. And let's compare two different compression settings. In the first compressor setting, I will keep the ratio quite high. Let's store this preset in a spare state. And in the second set of compressor settings, we will change the ratio to almost 2:1. And now if I press flip with spare state, I have an easy way to compare these two different compression settings. Despite the same attack and release controls, the compressor with less ratio gives a less clicky kick drum sound because the kick drum is compressed less. We can not only see that by looking at the ratio knob, but also by looking at the gain knob. In the second example where the ratio was much higher, I needed to add more decibels in the gain knob to make the kick drum on average as equal as the kick drum without compression. In the end, this is how I compress the kick drum. We can give it a final listen. And using a compressor on the kick drum was the very last thing in this tutorial. Now the kick and bass sound is finished, we can start adding synthesizer sounds, percussion to make a hard techno beat.